Sir, produce your papers, now.
Under what authority are you demanding that?
You're interfering with a federal investigation.
I'm a U.S. citizen and a police captain.
The man at the pump didn't flinch. His hand stayed steady on the nozzle. ICE agent Joe O'Brien stepped closer, flanked by Harold Grimes and Michael Lee, their vehicles boxing in the pickup truck at the empty station. The demand hung in the air, not a question, but a command wrapped in federal authority. The man's eyes met O'Brien's with the measured calm of someone who'd spent 2 decades navigating confrontations far more dangerous than this. But O'Brien wasn't looking for cooperation. He was looking for compliance. And when the driver's license and police captain's badge came out, when 20 years of service were laid bare on the hood of that Ford F-250, O'Brien and his team did something calculated. They examined the credentials, nodded, walked away. Their body cameras recorded every step of their departure. Then all 3 cameras went dark. What followed wasn't law enforcement. It was erasure. Dennis Dawson, a decorated police captain, was dragged into custody with racial slurs replacing his name and handcuffs replacing his dignity. His truck sat abandoned, groceries wilting in the bed, at a gas station that had been carefully chosen for its emptiness. What these agents didn't anticipate was the phone in Dawson's pocket, still pinging its location. And the wife who knew exactly where to look. Before we continue, what city or country are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. We love seeing where our community tunes in from across the globe. If you believe that being a police captain while black shouldn't be treated as grounds for detention, if you stand against agents who turn off their cameras to turn on their hatred, then hit that like button and subscribe. Your engagement isn't just support, it's a statement that this kind of abuse has no place in any badge, any agency, any system that claims to serve justice. Dennis Dawson had finished loading the last grocery bag into his truck bed at 3:47 p.m. The Riverside Shopping Center parking lot sprawled half-empty around him, the Saturday afternoon lull settling over the strip of chain stores and fast food joints. He'd promised his wife, Rebecca, and their 2 children, 14-year-old Alicia and 11-year-old Jordan, that he'd be home by 4:30 to start the grill for their weekly family cookout. 2 decades as a police officer, the last 8 as captain, had taught him the value of kept promises. Especially the small ones. Especially to family. He climbed into the Ford, civilian clothes comfortable after a week in uniform, and pulled out of the lot. The gas gauge hovered near empty. He'd fill up at the Speedway station 2 miles down Route 47, the one that usually sat quiet this time of day, away from the shopping center traffic. What Dawson didn't see was the unmarked black SUV that had been idling 3 rows over in the shopping center lot. Joe O'Brien sat behind the wheel, watching. He'd noticed Dawson loading the bags, expensive cuts of meat, fresh produce, the kind of groceries that didn't match O'Brien's assumptions about who belonged in this neighborhood, who could afford that truck. O'Brien had been with ICE for 6 years, long enough to trust his instincts, as he called them. Long enough to know which targets wouldn't have lawyers on speed dial, which confrontations could be shaped by narrative rather than fact. He signaled to Grimes and Lee in the trailing vehicle. They followed at a distance, professional and patient. The Speedway station materialized exactly as O'Brien had hoped, deserted. 2 pumps under a weathered canopy, a small convenience store with darkened windows, and not a single other vehicle in sight. No witnesses. No cameras pointed at the pumps. Just Dawson, his truck, and the distance between him and anyone who might intervene. O'Brien pulled in from the north entrance. Grimes and Lee blocked the south exit. The trap closed with the precision of men who'd done this before. Dawson had just squeezed the pump handle when he registered the vehicles. Not customers. The positioning was too deliberate, too tactical. He'd run enough operations to recognize a coordinated approach. His pulse stayed even, his hand steady on the nozzle, but his mind shifted into the cold assessment mode that had kept him alive through 20 years of patrol shifts, domestic calls, and armed standoffs. 3 men emerged. Federal jackets. ICE insignia. O'Brien led the approach, his body language aggressive, territorial. O'Brien demanded proof of citizenship without preamble, without legal foundation. The command came with no explanation of reasonable suspicion, no articulable facts justifying the stop. Just the demand itself, delivered as though Dawson's presence at a gas pump constituted probable cause. Dawson finished fueling, replaced the nozzle with deliberate slowness, and questioned the authority that gave them the right to demand identification from a citizen engaged in lawful activity on private property. O'Brien's face hardened. The question wasn't compliance. It was challenge. And challenges, in O'Brien's experience, required escalation. He threatened Dawson with cuffs, detention, and arrest if documents weren't produced immediately. Grimes and Lee fanned out, hands near their belts, creating angles of control. Dawson reached for his wallet with visible hands, narrating his movements the way he'd taught countless rookies during traffic stops. Driver's license first. Ohio. Current. His own face staring back from the laminated card. O'Brien barely glanced at it, dismissing it as insufficient, not federal, not proof. Then came the badge. Gold shield, Cleveland Police Department, captain's rank insignia etched into the metal that Dawson had carried for 8 years, earned through test scores and competency reviews and the kind of grinding case clearances that didn't make headlines but kept communities safer. O'Brien took it. Studied it. Turned it over in his hand as though weighing its authenticity. Grimes leaned in, examined the department ID card that accompanied the badge. Lee checked Dawson's face against the photo. The credentials were legitimate. Unquestionable. Current. For a moment, something shifted in O'Brien's expression, not respect, but calculation. He handed the badge back, gestured to his team. They withdrew toward their vehicles, movements casual, unthreatening. O'Brien's body camera recorded the departure, the return of credentials, the apparent resolution of a routine if unnecessary stop. Grimes' camera captured the same footage from a different angle. Lee's camera provided the third perspective, the triangulated evidence of an encounter ending peacefully. Then O'Brien's hand rose to his chest. Found the camera. Pressed the button that stopped recording. Grimes did the same. Lee followed within 2 seconds. 3 cameras, 3 simultaneous shutoffs, 3 black screens replacing the feed of a gas station encounter. Not malfunction. Not accident. Coordination. They turned back. O'Brien moved first, covering the distance between the SUV and Dawson's truck in 4 long strides. The words that came next weren't procedure. They were slurs, racial epithets delivered with the casual cruelty of men who believed the cameras had given them permission. O'Brien announced that Dawson's badge meant nothing because Dawson's skin meant everything. The medal didn't matter. The rank didn't matter. The 20 years didn't matter. Only the color, and the fact that they'd found him alone. Dawson's hands came up, palms out, the universal gesture of de-escalation. He repeated his rank, his department, the legal boundaries they were crossing. But Grimes already had the cuffs out, metal catching the late afternoon sun. Lee grabbed Dawson's right arm, twisting it back with force that sent pain through the shoulder joint. O'Brien seized the left. The cuffs ratcheted closed, tighter than necessary, tighter than training required, tight enough to cut circulation. Dawson's protests about procedure, about rights, about the illegality of detention without cause, dissolved into the empty air of the abandoned station. They dragged him toward the SUV, his feet stumbling over asphalt, his voice still measured despite the escalating violence. The truck sat behind them, groceries warming in the bed, keys in the ignition, driver's door hanging open like evidence of interruption. No one locked it. No one secured the scene. They simply took him, a police captain reduced to cargo in the back of a federal vehicle, hands cuffed behind his back, shoulders screaming from the angle. The drive to the ICE detention facility took 17 minutes. Dawson tracked every turn, cataloging landmarks through the SUV's windows the way he'd taught himself during his first years in patrol. Know your location. Know your route. Know how to get back. O'Brien drove in silence for the first 10 minutes. Then the mocking began. He questioned whether Dawson's badge had ever actually meant anything, whether his uniform made him forget what he really was, whether his department knew they'd given a badge to someone who looked like he belonged in detention, not behind a desk. Grimes joined in, his laughter sharp in the enclosed vehicle. Lee stayed quiet, eyes forward, but his silence was complicity. Dawson didn't respond. 20 years had taught him when words were weapons and when they were wasted. He focused instead on breathing, on keeping his pulse steady despite the adrenaline, on memorizing faces and names and the badge numbers visible on their jackets. This wasn't random. The cameras proved that. The coordination proved that. And beneath the procedural violations, beneath the racist mockery, Dawson sensed something else, something personal, something targeted. O'Brien's eyes in the rearview mirror held recognition. Not the generic recognition of a profiling stop, but something specific, something old. Dawson searched his memory for the face, for the name, for the connection. It hovered just out of reach, familiar but unplaceable. The facility loomed ahead, concrete and razor wire, built for people awaiting deportation, not for citizens with badges. The SUV pulled into the secure entrance, and Dawson understood the strategy with the cold clarity of someone who'd worked enough cases to see the pattern. They were going to disappear him into the system. No phone call. No verification. Just paperwork and holding cells and bureaucratic delays until the narrative could be controlled, until his absence became his fault, until the story could be rewritten as anything other than what it was, an arrest born from hatred, executed with cameras off, designed to humiliate and erase. The intake process stripped Dawson of everything that identified him as anything other than a detainee. Phone first, confiscated without documentation of its seizure. Wallet next, the driver's license and credit cards that proved residency and citizenship disappearing into a manila envelope. Then the badge, pried from his belt and dropped into the same envelope with the casual disregard of men who'd already decided its irrelevance. Watch, wedding ring, keys to the truck still sitting at the gas station, all of it catalogued with bureaucratic efficiency and stored beyond his reach. The holding cell measured 8 feet by 10, concrete floor scarred with old stains, metal bench bolted to the wall, toilet in the corner without partition or privacy. The door clanged shut with the finality Dawson had heard thousands of times from the other side. He'd walked suspects into cells exactly like this one, assured them of their rights, promised phone calls and due process. Now he sat on the bench, wrists still aching from cuffs removed only after the cell door locked, and recognized every delay tactic unfolding around him. He requested a phone call. The intake officer logged the request without response. He asked to verify his identity through the police department's central database. The officer made a note. Nothing happened. He demanded to speak with a supervisor, invoked his right to counsel, cited the specific violations of detention without probable cause. Each request received acknowledgement but not action. The system had swallowed him, and the system had learned to digest slowly. 2 decades in law enforcement had taught Dawson the architecture of bureaucratic stalling. The misplaced paperwork. The supervisor who was always in a meeting. The computer system conveniently down for maintenance. He'd seen it used against suspects who deserved better, and he'd fought it when he could. Now he felt it from the inside, not as theoretical injustice but as lived erasure. Every hour that passed without his phone call, without his identity confirmed, was an hour his family wouldn't know where he was, an hour the narrative could shift from kidnapping to lawful detention. He sat on the bench and forced his breathing into the measured rhythm he'd practiced during his first years in patrol, when calls still spiked his adrenaline and every domestic dispute felt like potential ambush. 4 counts in. Hold for 4. 4 counts out. The cell smelled of industrial cleaner and human desperation. Voices echoed from other cells, Spanish mostly, some Arabic, languages of people caught in the same machinery Dawson now occupied. He wondered how many were citizens. How many had papers but not the right accent? How many had been selected at gas stations and grocery stores and job sites for the crime of existing visibly? The reflection spiraled into anger, then back to control. Anger was useful only if channeled into action, and action required him to get out first. He reviewed what he knew, O'Brien's face, still nagging at his memory. The coordinated camera shutoff, which proved premeditation. The racial slurs, which established motive. The illegal detention of a citizen and police officer, which created liability so massive that someone, eventually, would have to respond. Unless they buried him deep enough that the liability never surfaced. 4 hours into his detention, 127 miles away, Rebecca Dawson noticed the silence. Dennis was late, not unusually late, not caught in traffic late, but genuinely, worryingly late. 4:30 had become 5, then 5:30. The calls went straight to voicemail, the mechanical voice announcing the number was unavailable. She tried 3 times before the first thread of real fear tightened in her chest. She opened the location-sharing app they'd both installed years ago, a small concession to the dangers inherent in police work. The blue dot appeared immediately, not at the shopping center, not on the route home, but stationary at an address she didn't recognize. She zoomed in. The pin dropped on a government facility labeled ICE Detention Center, Route 47. Her hands went cold. Dennis didn't work ICE cases. He ran the department's Community Relations Division. There was no reason, no possible explanation for his phone to be at a detention facility unless something had gone catastrophically wrong. She called his direct supervisor first, Chief Thomas Walsh, who'd worked patrol with Dennis 15 years ago before their careers diverged into separate trajectories of leadership. Walsh answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the relaxed tone of a Saturday evening until Rebecca explained the situation. The phone's location. The hours of silence. The sudden, inexplicable shift from grocery run to federal facility. Walsh's tone changed instantly, the relaxation replaced by the clipped urgency of a commander receiving actionable intelligence about an officer in distress. He was in his car within 4 minutes, uniform hastily pulled over civilian clothes, badge displayed on his belt, driving toward the facility with the efficiency of someone who understood that time and presence both mattered in negotiations. He called ahead, identified himself as Cleveland PD Chief, and requested confirmation that Captain Dennis Dawson was on site. The facility supervisor deflected, cited privacy regulations, and suggested calling back during business hours. Walsh responded with calibrated threat, FBI involvement for unlawful detention of a law enforcement officer, media exposure of citizenship violations, internal affairs investigations that would scrutinize every detention process that day. The deflection shifted to hesitation. Walsh arrived at the facility at 7:18 p.m., 6 hours and 14 minutes after Dawson had been dragged from the gas station. The entrance was designed to intimidate: high fences, surveillance cameras, guards behind reinforced glass. Walsh approached with the bearing of someone who'd walked into worse, his uniform and rank visible, his face set in the expression of a man prepared to escalate until compliance became easier than resistance. The confrontation with O'Brien happened in the facility's administrative office, where Walsh demanded Dawson's immediate release and O'Brien claimed no knowledge of any captain in custody. The lie was tactical but flawed. Rebecca had tracked the phone, and Walsh knew its location with GPS precision. He placed his own phone on the desk, the tracking app's blue dot pulsing on the facility's footprint, and asked O'Brien whether he'd like to explain how a police captain's phone ended up in ICE custody without ICE's knowledge. The room's temperature dropped. Other agents present, Grimes and Lee among them, exchanged glances that spoke of calculations and blame redistribution. Walsh invoked the FBI's Civil Rights Division. He mentioned media contacts who'd be interested in citizenship detention, then suggested that body camera footage would clarify the situation before asking pointedly whether the cameras had been operational during the arrest. O'Brien's face went carefully blank. The admission came slowly: yes, Dawson was in holding, there had been a misunderstanding about documentation, they were processing his release now. The cell door opened at 7:41. Dawson emerged with the controlled movements of someone fighting exhaustion and rage in equal measure. The cuffs had left deep red marks around his wrists, the kind that would bruise purple by morning. His eyes held the hollow look of someone who'd spent hours cataloging worst-case scenarios, each more plausible than the last. Walsh's presence grounded him: familiar face, friendly command structure, evidence that the system had boundaries even when individual actors tried to erase them. The drive home was silent for the first 10 minutes. Walsh didn't press. He'd seen enough trauma responses to recognize when quiet was processing, not avoidance. Finally, Dawson spoke, his voice rough from hours without water, and recounted the gas station, the cameras, the slurs, the calculated erasure. Walsh listened without interruption, his hands tight on the steering wheel, his jaw set in the kind of anger that didn't explode but calcified into action. They pulled into Dawson's driveway at 8:17. Rebecca was at the door before the car stopped, Alicia and Jordan visible behind her in the hallway. The reunion was tactile and desperate, arms wrapping around him, hands confirming his physical presence, voices overlapping with questions he didn't yet have energy to answer. Walsh stepped back, gave them space, and promised to call the next morning. Dawson nodded, then disappeared into his house, into the arms of his family, into the first moment of safety he'd felt in 6 hours. Later that night, after the children were asleep and Rebecca sat beside him on the couch, her hand in his, Dawson made the internal vow that would drive the next 14 months. This wouldn't disappear into bureaucratic memory. This wouldn't become another complaint dismissed by internal review. He would pursue every avenue, every legal mechanism, every public exposure necessary to ensure that what happened to him couldn't happen to the next person O'Brien decided to target. Justice wouldn't be satisfaction. It would be method, deliberate, documented, and devastatingly thorough. The civil rights attorney's office occupied the 11th floor of a downtown building with views of Lake Erie and the skyline Dawson had protected for 20 years. Chief Walsh had made the introduction, Patricia Keller, who'd built a reputation dismantling police misconduct cases and had recently pivoted to federal agency violations. She listened to Dawson's account with the focused attention of someone translating narrative into legal strategy, her notes precise, her questions surgical. When he finished, she leaned back and delivered her assessment. The case was extraordinary, the violations egregious, and the body camera shutoff was the kind of evidence that collapsed defenses before trial. The lawsuit filed 48 hours later demanded $8.9 million in damages and requested a comprehensive investigation into ICE's detention practices, with particular focus on racial profiling patterns and camera compliance. The complaint detailed every element of Dawson's arrest: the lack of reasonable suspicion, the coordinated camera deactivation, the racial slurs, the illegal detention of a United States citizen and law enforcement officer. It named O'Brien, Grimes, and Lee individually, and named their agency for systemic failures that enabled the violation. Keller's team verified the audio's authenticity through forensic analysis. The recordings were unedited, unenhanced, and devastating. They proved coordination at levels far beyond 3 rogue agents. They documented systemic corruption, quota pressures, and the deliberate creation of an environment where racial profiling became policy disguised as enforcement. Grimes' cooperation came with conditions, reduced charges, testimony shielded from certain liabilities, but the evidence was worth the negotiation. The third agent, Michael Lee, remained silent through the early discovery phases, his attorney maintaining the unified defense with O'Brien and Grimes. Then Keller's investigators found the family connection. Lee's mother's cousin had been detained by O'Brien 4 years prior, a citizen with documentation who'd been held for 3 days before release. The detention had cost the cousin his job, destabilized his family, and left trauma that manifested in Lee's reluctance to join ICE in the first place. Lee had been recruited by O'Brien personally, his hiring a calculated move to ensure loyalty through implicit threat: your family is vulnerable, your employment is protection. Lee broke quietly, through encrypted email to Keller's firm. The messages arrived over 3 days, each one containing forwarded emails from O'Brien coordinating false detention reports, discussing camera shutoffs as tactical tools, and explicitly referencing the Dawson arrest as settling an old score. Lee's motivation was complex: guilt over complicity, fear of O'Brien's control, and anger at the system that had weaponized his family's vulnerability. The emails provided the prosecution's direct link between grudge and action, between policy and personal malice. The Department of Justice announced its investigation 6 months after the lawsuit filing. The scope extended beyond Dawson's case to encompass nationwide ICE detention practices, camera compliance audits, and civil rights violation patterns. The announcement coincided with Keller's release of the audio recordings, edited for legal compliance but complete enough to demonstrate scope. The media coverage intensified. Congressional representatives called for hearings. Advocacy groups filed amicus briefs supporting Dawson's claims. The case transformed from individual lawsuit to catalyst for systemic examination. O'Brien, Grimes, and Lee faced mounting pressure as their defense collapsed piece by piece. The body camera evidence showed intent. The Academy connection proved motive. The audio revealed system. The emails documented conspiracy. Their attorneys shifted from denial to mitigation, from unified front to individual negotiations. The cracks widened into chasms, and through those chasms, the truth of 15 years and 39 stops and countless violations poured into public record. The settlement negotiations began 11 months after the lawsuit's filing, initiated by federal attorneys who'd reviewed the accumulated evidence and calculated the courtroom risks. The body camera footage alone would destroy credibility. The audio recordings would prove systemic rot. The Academy connection would demonstrate premeditated malice. And Dawson himself, decorated police captain, 20-year veteran, family man detained while buying groceries, was the kind of plaintiff who converted jury sympathy into 8-figure verdicts. The government's opening offer was $3.2 million with standard non-disclosure clauses. Keller rejected it within hours. Dawson wasn't interested in silence. He wanted accountability that echoed beyond his personal case, reforms that prevented the next gas station arrest, consequences that taught federal agents that cameras couldn't be turned off when inconvenience threatened to become evidence. The second offer came at $5.7 million with partial reform commitments. Still insufficient. The third negotiation stretched over 6 weeks, Keller leveraging the viral footage's 40 million views, the DOJ's expanding investigation, and the criminal charges looming against all 3 agents. The final settlement landed at $8.9 million, the largest in state history for a single racial profiling case. But the money was almost secondary to the mandates embedded in the agreement. ICE committed to annual racial bias training for all agents, developed by independent civil rights organizations rather than internal staff. Detention stops would require documented reasonable suspicion, reviewable by civilian oversight boards created specifically to audit enforcement patterns. Body cameras would be upgraded to tamper-proof models with automatic cloud upload, eliminating the possibility of convenient shutoffs. And most significantly, agents with pattern complaints, defined as 3 or more profiling allegations within 2 years, would face automatic suspension pending external investigation. The criminal proceedings unfolded parallel to the civil settlement. O'Brien faced conspiracy charges, civil rights violations, and falsification of federal documents. Grimes and Lee received lesser charges in exchange for cooperation, but cooperation didn't erase culpability. The trial was brief, the evidence too overwhelming for extended deliberation. O'Brien was convicted on all counts, sentenced to 6 years in federal prison, and permanently barred from law enforcement. His trajectory from Academy washout to ICE agent to convicted felon completed the arc of someone who'd spent 15 years nursing a grudge instead of examining the behavior that had earned it. The personal consequences extended beyond legal punishment. O'Brien's marriage dissolved during the investigation, his wife filing for divorce and relocating with their 2 children to a state where his name carried less infamy. His employability in any field requiring background checks evaporated. Post-incarceration, he found work in warehouse logistics and food delivery, jobs that didn't ask questions about gaps in employment or federal convictions. He became a symbol, not of reform or redemption, but of disgrace, his name invoked in training scenarios about abuse of authority and the consequences of letting prejudice dictate enforcement. Grimes accepted a plea deal that included 2 years in federal prison and 5 years probation, his cooperation earning mitigation but not forgiveness. His law enforcement career ended with his termination, his credentials revoked, his pension forfeited. He found work in private security, a step down that matched his diminished credibility. Lee's whistleblower role earned him probation without prison time, but his employment in federal service ended with the same finality. The cousin's detention haunted him, and his eventual testimony against O'Brien provided partial closure but not absolution. He left law enforcement entirely, moving into nonprofit work focused on immigrants' rights, an attempt at penance that would take years to evaluate. The broader investigation produced results that exceeded Dawson's initial expectations. DOJ audits identified similar patterns across 17 regional ICE offices, documenting quota pressures, camera compliance failures, and racial profiling rates that matched or exceeded the statistical anomalies in Dawson's case. 58 agents resigned or were terminated in the investigation's first wave. 19 faced criminal charges for civil rights violations, though plea deals and varying evidence quality produced outcomes ranging from convictions to dismissed charges. Dawson returned to work after 3 months of leave, during which he'd processed the trauma with a therapist who specialized in law enforcement PTSD and racial trauma. The department promoted him to deputy chief, a recognition of his experience and a signal that leadership valued officers who challenged injustice even when it complicated interagency relationships. His new role focused on community relations and accountability oversight, appropriate given that he now embodied both the vulnerability of community members and the responsibility of oversight. The settlement funds provided resources beyond personal compensation. Dawson established the Citizens Accountability Foundation, a nonprofit offering legal assistance and advocacy for individuals detained or profiled by federal agents. The foundation operated on a model of rapid response and evidence preservation, recognizing that cases like his often dissolved because victims lacked resources to fight bureaucratic delays. In its first 3 years, the foundation assisted over 150 people, recovering damages in 37 cases and forcing policy changes in 12 agencies. Dawson became a speaker, traveling to law enforcement conferences and civil rights symposiums to discuss accountability, camera integrity, and the intersections of race and authority that his case had exposed. His children watched him testify before congressional committees about detention practices, his voice measured and factual, his presence a reminder that systems change when individuals refuse to disappear quietly. Alicia eventually pursued law school, inspired by Keller's work. Jordan developed an interest in criminal justice reform, his father's case the foundational example of how institutions fail and how persistence forces correction. 5 years after the gas station arrest, Dawson sat in his deputy chief's office reviewing a proposal for a new community oversight board. He was 50 now, the white in his hair more prominent, the lines around his eyes deeper. The ordeal had cost him something, the naive belief that his badge would always protect him, the assumption that 2 decades of service created immunity from the prejudices he'd policed against. But it had also clarified his purpose. Justice wasn't the settlement check or the convictions. Justice was the reformed camera policies that prevented future shutoffs, the oversight boards that reviewed detention patterns, the 15 dozen people his foundation had helped, and the agents who now faced consequences for treating citizenship as conditional on skin color. The story didn't end with redemption in the Hollywood sense, O'Brien didn't apologize, the system didn't transform overnight, and the trauma didn't vanish into neat resolution. But accountability had been forced into institutions designed to avoid it. Reforms had been implemented in agencies that had resisted them. And Dawson had transformed his 6 hours in a cell into a mechanism for change that extended far beyond his personal grievance. He thought occasionally about the gas station, the moment O'Brien's hand had reached for the camera, the calculation that had assumed powerlessness. The assumption had been wrong. Not because Dawson was powerful in the traditional sense, but because he'd refused to let the erasure stand, because his wife had tracked his phone, because Walsh had arrived in uniform, because Keller had filed suit, because Grimes and Lee had cracked under pressure, because evidence had survived, and because public outrage had amplified private injustice into systemic reckoning. The reforms were fragile, dependent on continued oversight and political will that could shift with administrations. But they existed, codified in policy and monitored by boards with authority to audit and penalize. They represented the distance between the system that had allowed O'Brien to operate for 6 years and the system that now flagged pattern complaints for external review. The distance wasn't sufficient. No single case could dismantle structural racism embedded in institutions over decades, but it was measurable, documentable, and real. Dawson closed the proposal, added his endorsement, and forwarded it to the city council. Outside his window, Cleveland stretched toward the lake, the city he'd served through 2 decades of patrol shifts and administrative promotions. The view was the same. But the man who'd sat in that cell, cataloging worst-case scenarios and vowing private revenge, had evolved into someone who understood that justice wasn't personal vindication. It was the slow, methodical construction of systems that made future violations harder, costlier, and more visible. It was reforms that wouldn't bear his name but would prevent someone else's 6 hours from becoming forever.